Good morning, Section Z. We have been studying Chapter 12 on takings in the Dukeminier textbook. We've seen the regulatory takings jurisprudence applied by the Supreme Court that often applies a balancing test. We saw an example of that in the Penn Central case, which gave us kind of a canonical formulation of the test and the different factors that you apply. But we've also seen that the Supreme Court has occasionally carved out a per se rule of takings liability. And so in the Loretto case, we saw that a permanent physical occupation of property by virtue of government regulation is a taking per se. We have also seen in the Lucas case that a regulation that denies an owner all economically viable use of property will be deemed a taking, with the exceptions noted in Lucas. In this lecture, I wanted to briefly follow up with a couple of note cases that I wanted to call your attention to following the Lucas case, and then I want to move on to the next topic in the book of exactions. So let me pull up the note cases quickly here. Over on page 670, there is a case called Palazzola versus Rhode Island. This was a case where a state law restricted developments in wetlands, and you had an owner with an 18-acre parcel, and as a result of this wetlands restriction, the value of it significantly dropped, 94% drop in value from over $3 million to $200,000. And that was because you could only build one house now on the 18-acre parcel. And so the issue that the court was taking up in the Rhode Island case is whether this was a situation for applying the Lucas per se rule. Have you left the land economically idle so that it will be per se deemed a taking without having to go through the balancing test from Penn Central? And the court decided that this was not a case for applying the Lucas rule. That the court said that leaving the ability to build a house on the property prevented you from saying that it was economically idle, and therefore the Lucas rule was not the appropriate test to apply. Although the court did say that leaving a token interest with the landowner would not be enough to avoid takings liability under the Lucas rule. There was also another issue in the case about whether you can assert a takings claim. Remember that the Lucas case had focused on limitations on property rights that were inherent in your title. And so even if the government deprived you of all economically viable use of your property, if they were doing so in a situation that would have been a nuisance at common law, well, they weren't taking anything from you because that was already a limitation on your property rights that was built in when you acquired them, and so they haven't taken anything from you by preventing you from using your property in a way that would be a nuisance. And so one question that came up in Palazzola is the fact that the wetlands regulation was adopted before the plaintiff in the case had acquired the property. I think, if I remember correctly, the property was at one point owned by a corporation of which this individual was the sole shareholder, and then later, after the wetlands regulation, the corporation was dissolved, and so the individual acquired the property that previously had belonged to the corporation. But in any event, the question then was, well, since this wetlands regulation had been adopted before this individual acquired individual ownership of the property, did that prevent bringing a takings claim on the ground that this wetlands regulation was now built into his property rights as a limitation on his title? The Supreme Court decided that he could still exercise his right to bring a takings claim even though he acquired after the regulation was adopted. He said that they said that the kinds of regulations that we're talking about that are kind of built into the title are ones that are of long standing. they say, our description of the concept in Lucas is explained in terms of those common shared understandings of permissible limitations derived from a state's legal traditions. A regulation or common law rule cannot be a background principle for some landowners, but not for others. So they're talking, when they talk about limitations inherent in your title, they're talking about things, rules, principles that have been around for a long time as limitations on your property rights. The other note case I wanted to call your attention to over here on page 671, note 4, is the case involving Tahoe Preservation, Tahoe Sierra Preservation Council. Here you had a temporary moratorium on development around Lake Tahoe, that prevented use of the land for a period of time while the government decided what to do. And so I think it was maybe 32 months or something, but there was a period of time in which the landowner was prevented from developing their land while the government kind of made plans, but it was not permanent, or at least in theory, it was not permanent. It was supposed to lapse after a while. And at some point, the government would make a decision and it would adopt permanent regulations. And the Supreme Court decided that a temporary moratorium on development that prevents you from using land for a period of time is not a per se taking requiring just compensation under a rule, the Lucas rule. Now, the next topic in the book is the problem of exactions. And there are a couple of cases they give us where the Supreme Court has kind of applied particular takings principles in this context. So what's an exaction? An exaction is, the authors tell us, a situation where the local government has measures that require developers to provide goods and services, or pay fees as a condition of getting project approval. The authors point out that there's a lot of increase in land use regulation in the 1970s, and a concern arose about whether particular jurisdictions were misusing exactions as essentially a substitute for taxes or a way of raising revenue or resources for the community. Page 671, local communities enacting regulations is like printing money because the legal restrictions can be relaxed in exchange for goods and services. The politics of the strategy are pretty obvious, and finally exactions became so common and troublesome that the Supreme Court intervened. And so they intervened in a couple of cases that are described for us in this note. The first one is the case of Nolan versus California Coastal Commission. So let me pull up a diagram that will show you kind of what was going on in the Nolan case. Here it's this one over on the left-hand side of the screen. In the Nolan case, we had some beachfront property. And so here's the ocean up here, and then here's the water line. Then there is the wet sand, kind of the sand below the mean high tide mark. And you remember we talked earlier about how under something called the public trust doctrine, that wet sand is thought of as being owned by the government in trust for the public, so that members of the public have the right to walk along the wet sand beach. But the dry sand above the mean high tide mark, that can be the subject of private ownership. And so in the Nolan case, you have some landowners who have a beachfront lot, and there's a seawall between them and the dry sand, and they have a little bungalow on the lot. And they want to kind of tear that bungalow down and replace it with a larger 3-bedroom structure. And there are larger houses in that area, so they want to make it similar to others in the neighborhood. So they need to get government approval to tear down this bungalow and build a larger house. Specifically, they've got to get a development permit from the California Coastal Commission. The commission says that they're willing to grant the permit under one condition, that the Nolans have to grant an easement for the public to walk across the part of their property by the beach, the dry sand that they own between the seawall and the mean high tide mark. And so they would essentially extend the amount of the beach that the public could walk on. So there are public beaches in both directions from here. And so if people are trying to walk from one of those public beaches to the other public beach, they have the right currently under the public trust doctrine to walk along the wet sand. But the California Coastal Commission says, well, as a condition of your getting this permit to develop your lot and build a bigger house, we want you to give us an easement so that the public can also walk across the dry sand in front of your property as they're going from one public beach to another. Now, the Supreme Court looks at this exaction, this condition attached to the building permit, and they think about whether there is a legitimate government interest that could have resulted in denial of the permit. Could the government have kind of turned down the Nolan's request for a development permit altogether? And they decide there is a legitimate government concern here, which is that the development is going to kind of interfere with visual access to the beach from the public street up here. That if somebody is driving along here and they're looking down towards the ocean, they're not going to be able to see it as well if you replace this smaller bungalow with a larger house. And so the court at least assumes that that is a legitimate government interest that is so significant that the Coastal Commission could have turned down the request to build the larger house altogether. And so then the question becomes, well, does that legitimate government interest allow the government to attach the condition it did, which is an easement to walk along the dry sand? And the Supreme Court decides that even though they had the power to deny the permit, that doesn't mean the Coastal Commission could attach any condition it wanted to the granting of the permit. There has to be what the court calls an essential nexus between the asserted problem created by the development and the condition or the exaction that is being attached. And so here, the problem is supposedly that people here on the street are going to have trouble seeing the beach, and the court can't see how that is connected with an easement that lets people who are already on the beach walk along the dry sand in front of the Nolan's property. The court says, you know, maybe if you had a different condition, maybe if you said as a condition of building your larger house, you have to provide a spot here on your property so that people in cars can come down and take a look at the beach from your property. That would be potentially a permissible condition because there would be an essential nexus to the problem that the Coastal Commission says that the development is creating. But where the problem is access, the ability to see the beach from the street side, that doesn't justify the condition here, the exaction of an easement for those who are already on the beach side of the property. The second case that the Supreme Court uses to address this problem of exactions is this Nolan case from Oregon. In this case, you have the owner of a plumbing and electrical supply store. And what she wants to do is she wants to expand the size of the store, make it a bigger plumbing store. And simultaneously, she wants to expand the size of the parking so that there will be more paved parking on her lot than there was previously. And so the city imposes a couple of conditions. It says if you want your permit to expand your store in these ways, you're going to have to do a couple of things. First of all, we want you to dedicate to the city all of your property that is in the floodplain from Fano Creek, which is kind of along one edge of the property. So, whatever the floodplain is, all of that property we want to now belong to the government instead of belonging to the private landowner. And they focus on the 100-year floodplain. So I guess the portion that you would expect to get flooded like once every 100 years as a result of filling up Fano Creek. And then they also wanted, in addition to the floodplain, they wanted an additional 15 feet for a bike and pedestrian path kind of along the edge of the property down by the creek for pedestrian and bicycle traffic. And so let's think about the essential nexus requirement that we saw articulated in the Nolan case. Is that met here? And the Supreme Court decides, yes, that is met. First of all, the city has a legitimate interest in preventing flooding of the property, and that the development of the property is actually going to increase the flood risk because there's going to be more of the property that is covered by pavement, more of it covered by building presumably as well, and therefore less water will soak down into the soil when there is a rain, more of it will run off into the creek, and therefore you're increasing the risk of flooding in Fano Creek by this development. And therefore asking that the landowner dedicate the floodplain, the land in the floodplain has an essential nexus to that legitimate government purpose, because then the government can make sure that nothing gets developed in that floodplain, which would create problems when there's flooding. The other exaction is the 15 feet for the bike and pedestrian path. And here, there is also an essential nexus to a problem created by the development. The problem is, if you build a bigger store and provide more parking, you may increase the amount of traffic coming to the store. So there may be more people coming in and parking in the parking lot so that they can go and shop in the store. That may make the streets out here in the city more congested than they would be otherwise. And so there is an essential nexus between that and the requirement that you allow a bicycle and pedestrian path, because that is one way to potentially reduce the amount of car traffic by providing people the ability to get to the store either by bicycle or on foot. And so both of the exactions in this case meet the essential nexus test that we saw articulated in the Nolan case. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court says that they are still problematic, still are or may be takings of property, because it imposes a second requirement for exactions, which is that there has to be a rough proportionality between the impact of the new development and the condition that is attached. And so it's not just that they have to be related logically through the essential nexus test, but there has to be kind of a relationship in terms of the size of the impact compared to the size of the exaction. And so with respect to the concern about flooding, the court decides that this rough proportionality test has not been met. The city's legitimate interest is in making sure that no building goes on in the floodplain, so that if there is increased runoff, flooding doesn't cause as big of a problem. But that does not require what the city is requesting here, which is that you actually dedicate that land, give it to the public. That the government's legitimate interest here could be met by less of an exaction, a less onerous condition, which is simply that the landowner still owns that property, but the landowner can't build anything in the floodplain. That's enough to satisfy the legitimate government interest, and therefore, by requiring more, the government has not satisfied the rough proportionality test. The other condition that you set aside land for the bike and pedestrian pathway, here the essential nexus test is met. The Supreme Court just decides it doesn't have enough information to decide whether it is roughly proportional. And so it sends it back to the city because they didn't make adequate findings to show how much increased traffic there would be as a result of the increased size of the store and the parking lot, and how much of that traffic would get diverted if you create the bike and pedestrian path. And so they have to make an effort to quantify their findings somehow to show that the exaction for the bike path is roughly proportional to the increased impact of traffic resulting from the development. So that shows a particular area where the court has applied some unique tests to measure whether particular government regulatory actions connected to the issuance of permits will be deemed to be takings requiring just compensation.